Is it really better to roll in filth than to leave this world? A philosophical reflection on why being human is a rare privilege. There is a saying often repeated by older generations in East Asia: even rolling in a field of filth in this world is better than the afterlife. At first glance, this sounds crude, almost cynical. Is life really so precious that even its most degrading moments outweigh whatever comes after death? Tonight, I invite you to pause and examine this proverb more carefully, because beneath its rough exterior lies one of the most profound insights ever expressed about what it means to be human. By the end of this talk, I believe you will see your own existence differently. You may even realize, perhaps for the first time, how extraordinary it is that you were born as a human being at all. And if reflections on philosophy, consciousness, and the soul resonate with you, I invite you to subscribe and continue this journey together. What does this saying really mean? When people say, even rolling in filth in this world is better than the afterlife, they are not celebrating suffering, nor are they dismissing the spiritual world. Rather, the statement rests on an unspoken assumption that only in the human realm do beings fully experience sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and something even more elusive: inspiration, reflection, and self-awareness. At its core, this proverb is not about despair. It is about an intuitive recognition of what we might call the sensory and conscious privilege of being human. Let us explore this insight from three perspectives: Buddhist philosophy, Western philosophy, modern psychology. 1. The Buddhist perspective. Why the human realm is rare. In Buddhist cosmology, particularly in texts such as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, existence unfolds across 6 realms of rebirth. Among these, the human realm, the human path, is regarded as uniquely precious. Why? Not because it is comfortable, not because it is pure, but because it is the only realm where both sensory experience and conscious awareness function together in balance. Consider the contrast. In hell realms, sensation exists, but it is overwhelmed by pain. Awareness collapses under suffering. In the hungry ghost realm, desire remains, but satisfaction is impossible. In animal realms, sensory perception exists, but reflective awareness does not. In heavenly realms, pleasure abounds, but comfort dulls the urgency for awakening. Only in the human realm do pain and pleasure, instinct and reflection, limitation and transcendence coexist. Human existence is a delicate equilibrium. This is why the Tibetan Book of the Dead describes human life as the single gate through which light can be seen. Only here do consciousness and the body align perfectly enough for learning, transformation, and awakening. To see color, to hear music, to smell rain, to taste bitterness and sweetness, to feel touch, warmth, grief, love. And beyond all of this, to reflect on meaning itself. This convergence occurs only in the human realm. 2. A philosophical reframing. I feel, therefore I exist. Western philosophy often traces existence to thought. Descartes famously declared, "I think, therefore I am." But from a Tibetan philosophical perspective, we might say something slightly different. I feel, therefore I exist. Sensation is not merely biological input. It is the bridge through which existence meets the world. When sensation disappears, the world dissolves. When the senses shut down, consciousness loses its anchor. Thus, when people instinctively say, "This world is better than the afterlife," they are affirming something fundamental: that to feel is to remain vibrantly alive within existence itself. Even pain confirms presence. Even discomfort testifies to participation in reality. In this sense, the proverb is not nihilistic. It is existentially affirmative. 3. The psychological perspective. Sensation as the boundary of the self. From psychology, particularly through Freud and Jung, we learn that sensation defines the boundary of the ego. Through seeing, hearing, and touching, we distinguish self from world, inside from outside, present from imagined. After death, according to Tibetan descriptions of the Bardo state, these boundaries dissolve. Inner images and outer realities merge. Form and memory blur. The ego collapses. This is why the Bardo is described as terrifying, not because it is evil, but because the structure of identity disintegrates. The loss of sensation is not numbness. It is the dissolution of selfhood. Thus, humans instinctively cling to the sensory world, not out of fear alone, but out of loyalty to existence itself. I want to feel. Therefore, I want to remain. This is not mere survival instinct. It is the soul's confession of allegiance to being. So, what does the proverb truly say? Even rolling in filth in this world is better than the afterlife ultimately means this. Even in suffering, the present moment where we can feel, reflect, and choose represents the highest state of existence available to us. Through sensation, we experience the vibrations of the universe. Through sensation, consciousness refines itself. In the Bardo, only awareness remains. But only here, awareness is given the instruments of color, sound, texture, love, and pain. This world, flawed and imperfect as it is, becomes the final classroom. From a Buddhist perspective, this is why the human realm is called the most precious rebirth. Not because it is clean, not because it is easy, but because awakening is still possible. If there is a gift that existence offers humanity, it is this. Even in hardship, even in humiliation, even in suffering, we are still alive within sensation. And that, perhaps, is the last and greatest gift given to human beings. If this reflection resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe, share, and continue this exploration of consciousness, life, and meaning together. The journey, after all, is only possible while we can still feel it. Why being born human is rarer than a miracle. Pleasure, pain, and the paradox of awakening. There's a striking passage in one of the earliest Buddhist scriptures, the Samyukta Agama, known in East Asia as the Jabaham-gyong. It says this: to be born with a human body is more difficult than for a blind turtle rising once every 100 years from the depths of the ocean to place its head through a single hole in a floating piece of wood. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is a deliberate attempt to shock the listener into awareness. The Samyukta Agama is among the oldest collections of the Buddhist teachings, focusing on foundational doctrines such as the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and dependent origination. In other words, this metaphor appears not in later mysticism, but at the very core of early Buddhist thought, and its meaning is unmistakable. Human birth is extraordinarily rare, not an accident, but an accumulation. This teaching aligns perfectly with what the Tibetan Book of the Dead emphasizes again and again, that being born human is not accidental. It is the result of vast accumulations of karma actions, intentions, and moral causes layered across countless lifetimes, which leads to a radical conclusion. Even a life that feels like a field of filth, even a life filled with struggle, disappointment, and pain, must not be wasted. Why? Because this very moment, right here, right now, is the optimal condition for awakening. To lose oneself entirely in despair, or to postpone inner work until some imagined future, is to misunderstand the nature of this opportunity, the nature of human pleasure. Now, let us speak honestly about pleasure. Human pleasure arises through physical sense organs: sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. These pleasures are only possible because consciousness is bound to a physical body. And that very fact introduces limitation. Human pleasure is defined by friction, by contact, by impermanence. It has two defining characteristics. First, conditionality. When the object disappears, the pleasure disappears. Second, duality. Where pleasure exists, suffering inevitably follows. This is why the Tibetan Book of the Dead refers to the human realm as the world where suffering and joy always accompany each other. In classical Buddhist language, this is called 苦乐相伴, pleasure and pain walking side by side. Human joy is sweet, but never pure. It is always mixed with attachment. And attachment, without exception, becomes the seed of suffering, the fourfold structure of human suffering. Because the human realm contains both joy and pain, it becomes the arena of learning. And this learning is structured through specific forms of suffering. Buddhism identifies four major categories that define the human condition. First, birth, aging, illness, and death. To be born is to move inevitably toward decline. This is not pessimism, it is biological reality. Second, the suffering of separation from what we love. Love is not denied in Buddhism. It is understood deeply. And precisely because love is profound, loss cuts deeply. Third, the suffering of encountering what we resent. Human life guarantees confrontation with people, systems, and circumstances we would rather avoid. Fourth, the suffering of unfulfilled desire, wanting what cannot be obtained or what cannot remain. These are not moral failures. They are structural features of existence. Why this makes the human realm ideal for awakening. Here is the paradox. Because the human realm contains both suffering and pleasure, it becomes the only realm where insight can arise naturally. In heaven, pleasure is so abundant that urgency disappears. In hell, suffering is so overwhelming that reflection collapses. But here, pain teaches impermanence, and pleasure tests attachment. This is why Buddhism does not seek to eliminate experience, but to understand it. The teaching of pleasure already contains suffering. The Tibetan Book of the Dead extends this insight further. It teaches that human life itself is a form of living. Bardo, a transitional state where consciousness continuously oscillates between clarity and confusion. It warns, when you love someone intensely, the seed of separation has already been planted. Love is the highest joy of the human world, and simultaneously, its greatest vulnerability. The deeper the love, the stronger the fear of loss. The stronger the attachment, the sharper the pain of separation. This is why Tibetan Buddhism uses the phrase, pleasure is already suffering. Not because pleasure is evil, but because it binds the self when clung to. Thus, the practitioner must learn not to abandon love, but to love without possession. Wealth, power, and the shadow they cast The Tibetan Book of the Dead contrasts the human realm with heavenly realms using a striking metaphor. Golden pleasures are like lightning blinding in their brilliance, gone in an instant. Wealth brings comfort, but also fear of loss. Power brings influence, but also enemies. The greater the pleasure, the longer the shadow. This is the core structure of Kula Shangban. As light intensifies, darkness follows. Praise, ego, and the trap of identity. In the Sidpa Bardo, the threshold of rebirth, the deceased witnesses visions, shaped entirely by their own karma. At this moment, a subtle danger appears. The thought, I was right, I lived well, I was good. And in that instant, pride arises. According to the text, this pride, however, subtle, becomes ignorance, and ignorance pulls consciousness back into rebirth. Thus, the Tibetan Book of the Dead warns, do not rejoice in praise. That joy becomes the chain of the next life. Recognition feeds the ego, and ego dissolves freedom. Desire as the wind of karma. Physical pleasures, food, sex, rest, offer momentary relief. But when the pleasure fades, desire returns stronger. The text calls this the wind of karma. Each gust shakes consciousness, generating new craving, pulling awareness toward lower realms of existence. Pleasure itself is not the problem. Chasing pleasure is. That chase plants karmic seeds that ripen as future suffering. Even enlightenment has a terrifying face. At the moment of death, the deceased encounters the clear light, the pure radiance of ultimate reality. It is liberation, and yet it is terrifying. The light is so intense, so absolute, that consciousness recoils. Unable to endure it, the being turns away, choosing familiarity over freedom. Thus, even awakening participates in the structure of pleasure and pain. This is what Tibetan Buddhism calls wisdom born of fear. Not fear as weakness, but fear as the threshold where illusion collapses. To be human is to live at the intersection of joy and suffering. This is not a flaw. It is the design. Because only here, where pain teaches impermanence and pleasure tests attachment, can wisdom be born. That is why human birth is rarer than a miracle. And that is why even a difficult life must never be dismissed. It is, quite literally, the best possible place to awaken. When pleasure becomes the beginning of hell, power, illusion, and the final question of consciousness. According to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, when a person stands at the threshold of rebirth, their consciousness is forced to confront its own karma direct. There is no external judge, no divine tribunal. The mind sees itself. At that moment, the deceased may witness scenes as radiant, as heavenly realms, brilliant lights, overwhelming beauty, a sense of elevation beyond ordinary reality. But here lies the paradox. If the mind becomes intoxicated by that brilliance, if it clings to the light rather than understands it, it is immediately blinded. And when the light blinds, the fall into darkness is inevitable. This is the living meaning of le chico, la chico. Pleasure already contains the seed of suffering. Power as a modern form of bardo. This structure does not exist only in metaphysical afterlife narratives. It operates with ruthless precision in the world of politics and power. When a leader seizes authority through corruption, bribery, violence, manipulation, or moral compromise, The pleasure they experience is not neutral. At the very moment they taste success, they have already absorbed the karmic cause of collapse. The Tibetan Book of the Dead warned, golden indulgence is like lightning, a flash of brilliance that blinds the eyes. Power dazzles, adulation intoxicates. Authority creates the illusion of invulnerability. But once the flash fades, what remains is not stability. It is the hallucination of control dissolving into fear. This is DOUK1 made visible, the shadow that always follows illicit power. History provides endless examples. A ruler who rises through assassination, fraud, violence, or the exploitation of the weak may enjoy a brief season of luxury. But behind that pleasure comes its shadow: diplomatic isolation from major powers, economic sanctions from former allies, the absence of legitimate recognition, and the internal paranoia that no throne built on fear can be secure. The pleasure was real, but it was never free. The suffering was already embedded within it. I was right, the most dangerous thought. In the Sidpa Bardo, the stage of rebirth, the deceased witnesses images shaped entirely by their own actions. At this moment, a single thought seals their fate. I was right. I was justified. I did nothing wrong. The instant this thought arises, pride crystallizes into ignorance, and ignorance becomes the force that pulls consciousness back into suffering. This is not merely religious metaphor. When modern leaders declare, "I was right," the people did not understand. History will absolve me. They have already entered the psychological equivalent of samsara, the endless repetition of self-justifying suffering, the trap of praise and recognition. The Tibetan Book of the Dead issues a warning that feels almost surgical in its precision. Do not rejoice in praise. That joy becomes the chain of the next life. Praise strengthens identity. Identity hardens attachment. Attachment destroys freedom. This is why higher power inevitably attracts greater enemies. It is not bad luck. It is the weight of accumulated karma. Thus, DOUK1 does not mean that happiness is followed by misfortune. It means something far more unsettling. Suffering is already present inside pleasure itself. The political meaning of DOUK1. From the perspective of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, corrupt power, false success, and unearned praise are not rewards. They are chains forged at the threshold of rebirth. If one who holds power cannot see their own moral blindness, they do not merely risk downfall, they manufacture their own hell. Pleasure is suffering, a misunderstood teaching. When Buddhism says pleasure is suffering, it is not condemning joy. It is warning against blindness. DOUK1 teaches us to perceive impermanence inside delight. Political glory, public admiration, wealth, and authority appear as light. But inside that light already exists its shadow. The Tibetan Book of the Dead asks each of us a devastatingly simple question. Will you see the light, or will you be blinded by it? The answer depends on one thing alone: the courage to face one's own karma. Why heaven is more dangerous than hell. Buddhism describes heavenly realms as the most beautiful and the most dangerous trap. Why? Because beings in heavenly realms are born through vast stores of good karma. They experience light, harmony, music, fragrance, love, and peace. But precisely because their existence is so refined, their karmic exhaustion is slow. Their pleasure is so complete that it erases the awareness of impermanence. And when that heavenly life ends, they often fall sometimes into the human realm, sometimes below. The Tibetan Book of the Dead warned, heavenly pleasures are like a long dream. Awakening comes only when the light disappears. Heaven contains little suffering, but it also contains no urgency. And without urgency, awakening stalls. Why human pleasure is inferior and superior. Heavenly pleasure is vibrational, subtle, nearly pure consciousness. Human pleasure is sensory, rough, incomplete, and often painful. Yet this imperfection is precisely what creates space for awakening. Human pleasure wounds us. Human loss breaks us open. Human suffering forces reflection. Heavenly beings are too comfortable to question existence. Humans are not. This is why Mahayana Buddhism states, more precious than heaven is the human body, because only humans seek truth in suffering. The unique power of human senses. According to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the five senses are not merely biological instruments. They are vibrational interfaces of consciousness. After death, beings still experience light, sound, fragrance, and form. But these are perceived directly by consciousness, not through organs. These bardo senses are unstable, distorted, and unbalanced. Only in the human body do the senses form a stable, integrated system. That is why this moment, this body, this life, is described as the most precious opportunity for awakening. The true meaning of better to live than to die. We often hear the phrase, even rolling in filth in this world is better than the afterlife. This is not cynical comfort. From a Buddhist perspective, it is a profound statement of ontology. Among the 6 realms of rebirth, only the human realm allows liberation. Heaven is too pleasant. Hell is too painful. Animals are too ignorant. Hungry ghosts are too consumed by craving. But humans, even in suffering, can choose awakening. This is why the Samyukta Agama declares, to obtain a human body is rarer than a blind turtle placing its head through a floating wooden ring. Human life is rare. Human life is fragile. Human life is unfinished. And precisely for that reason, it is sacred. Your existence is not an accident. Even in pain, even in despair, even in a life that feels like a field of filth, this body, this moment, is a chance to purify karma, a chance to grow consciousness, a chance to awaken. The Tibetan Book of the Dead offers one final warning. If you do not practice while you have obtained this body, it will be difficult to obtain it again. To study death, then, is not to abandon life. It is to learn how to love life more deeply, more honestly, and without blindness. If this reflection helped you see your own life with new clarity, your like and subscription become a small act of shared merit. Thank you for walking this philosophical path together.